Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Ask Me Anything on Azure Synapse. If you have joined us for our other two sessions this morning, thank you and welcome to the third session. We will also be presenting all three sessions this afternoon, all live again, and we will share the links to the meetup page in the event Q&A if you would like to attend those afternoon sessions if you missed any this morning. We would love to get live audience questions on this AMA today, so you should see an icon that is two text boxes, and the top text box has a question mark in it. That is going to be where you can ask questions. We will be monitoring that, reading the questions out loud and answering those for the next 25 minutes or so. Again, thank you all so much for joining us, and I am now going to pass it over to Cheryl, who is going to be our moderator today, and we can start doing some quick intros. Cheryl, go ahead.
Okay, and thank you so much for joining us on this interesting topic when we're going to be speaking at this particular week all about data. I want to introduce myself. I'm Cheryl Adams. I'm a senior content developer for SQL Docs. What I do primarily is help assist and support in writing a lot of the documentation that is used for implementing various forms of SQL. So to that, I'm going to slide over to Rahul, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, and then Saveen.
Thanks a lot, Cheryl. Hello, everyone. My name is Rahul Potharaju. I'm an engineering manager in Microsoft working in the Azure Data Group. My team is responsible for shipping Spark inside Azure Synapse Analytics. And in addition to this, we also do a ton of open source work, some of the prominent projects being Hyperspace and also .NET for Spark, which you may have heard in like some of my previous talks. But you can either reach out to us in this AMA or perhaps on GitHub too. So looking forward to questions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Saveen Reddy. I'm a group program manager in the Synapse team. Now, I've played many roles in the Synapse team, but the one I'm working on right now is making sure developers have the right educational resources and also making sure we have the right relationships with our community and partners.
Great. So, let's get started. And I want to tap into the first question that we've gotten, which is about data. I wonder, is there a minimum size for data? Saveen, how would you address that?
It's surprising we get this question a lot. Often we talk so much about Synapse scaling to massive needs, gigabytes, petabytes if needed. But the truth is, we always talk about limitless, so people tend to focus on the upper end of it. In fact, limitless also goes down too. In other words, there is no specific size, which is the minimum. If you have even megabytes, Synapse is a really great solution because it's easy to work with the data. And that scales all the way up to any size, all the way to petabytes. So there's no minimum, if that helps answer.
That's a great perspective because that is something that people are often challenged with when they're looking for solutions, wondering if the amount of data they have is either too big or too small. So I certainly appreciate you addressing that. This brings me to another question as we talk about Synapse and data, and we're hearing all these terms and terminologies, and I want to just kind of lay a foundation of understanding. Can either one of you kind of share with me the difference between Apache Spark and Apache Spark for Synapse? What are the differences between those two?
Rahul, why don't you give that a try?
Yeah, I'd be happy to explain. So Apache Spark, for those of you who have gone to the Apache Spark website, like you'll also know that you'll have to download Apache Spark probably like either from one of their binaries or you'll have to kind of build it from source. But then if you've ever run like Spark clusters, you'll know the pain that comes with it, which is you have to configure everything from scratch. You need to make sure you acquire all of your compute resources, you hook it up with HDFS. There's a lot that happens in the background. Whereas if you start thinking about Synapse, it's actually quite intuitive. If you looked at my demo in the previous session, I did nothing other than just saying, I want to create a Spark pool inside Synapse and I want to attach my notebook to it. There was no physical cluster that I was spinning up. There was nothing that I did in terms of really setting up Spark or HDFS or anything like that. So in one way, one Synapse actually simplifies everything. So this Spark that we offer inside Synapse is actually quite intuitive and simple. There's not much to kind of really think about before you start using it. And two, of course, is it just the open source Spark? No, definitely not. So Microsoft has decades worth of experience when it comes to building databases, and you've already seen some of the best and world-class databases in the form of SQL Server, for instance. There's a lot of expertise that is inside our broader Azure Data Org, which is being now built into the Spark that you're going to use inside Synapse. So there's a lot of optimizations that we put in place. There's a lot of experience pieces that we have enhanced inside the Synapse offering inside Synapse.
I love all of that because it sounds like there's been a lot of work and a lot of effort in pulling all of these things together. I love that you also mentioned about open source because that's a lot that we're hearing about, but Microsoft has some offerings that pair very nicely with a lot of the open source. So I love that we can kind of pull all of those resources together. And speaking of pull, I know that there are two different kinds of SQL pools in Synapse. Can either one of you address or kind of share with us how they're different? That's another question we got.
Right. So what you're referring to is we'll start with the concepts. There are dedicated pools and there are serverless pools. And in the industry, dedicated can also be called something like provisioned or cluster model. But let's talk about the nature of the two things. Dedicated in general means you're reserving some amount of capacity to do something. And serverless means sort of the capacity to do it is managed by Microsoft and you use it and you pay for it as you use it, or you pay for it as you use it. So we have dedicated SQL pools and serverless SQL pools. And they follow those two frameworks, like I said. One is about provision capacity. One is about sort of on demand, we used to call it. Capacity is available as you do per queries. Now, let's ignore just those and get some concrete sense of how and why you'd be using them. So the dedicated pool is a very familiar concept for a lot of people. Everyone sort of understands you allocate a set of things and you pay for that allocation, in a flat rate over time. And it's predictable. And also it comes from a certain lineage of usage. A certain language feature set from T-SQL. The enterprises understand that model. Now, serverless is new. Serverless is, in some sense, it's a little harder to conceptualize, right? But what it's great for is when you want to do things like you have very ad hoc workloads. In other words, you're not sure what you're going to query for. It's great for exploring data, which is a classic ad hoc scenario. It's great for doing proof of concepts because you're not sure how much capacity you're going to need, right? It's great for all these flexible things. And because unlike a dedicated pool, which is by definition, a certain number of resources, these serverless pools, remember, they pull from resources that Microsoft manages in the entire region. In other words, it can scale up to like larger and larger numbers of users. So forgetting the technology, these are how the scenarios are different. Now, over time, the vision is that serverless and dedicated become the same thing. We'll get there over time, but what you'll be able to see in Synapse is the serverless pool world will start taking on the attributes of the dedicated pool world and vice versa. Dedicated pools become more flexible and take on the feature sets that were unique to serverless. So they're on a slow movement together.
I really want to point out that I like that you're extracting and explaining a lot of those things. When we hear terms like serverless, people start to get overwhelmed with all the different technology terms. What do they mean? How do they relate to what I'm doing? So I really appreciate the fact that you were able to walk through and break down some of those things and give us some real use case definitions, because I think that's helpful as we continue to kind of expand our knowledge about the data that we have, the data that we're going to acquire, and how we manage the data that we already have. It brings to mind another question as we continue to talk about Synapse. One of the biggest, most pressing issues that people have is support. There's so many organizations and companies and departments that have pre-existing data. And so as they take on new technologies and services and initiatives, support is always an issue. So to that vein, I wanted to bring up the next question. Does Spark for Synapse support Delta Lake, and what's the plan for that going forward?
Yeah,
Rahul, could you take this one?
Yeah, I can take this one. So yes, actually the good news is Synapse Spark does support Delta Lake, and you can feel free to start using anything from the open source documentation. And our goal has been to provide you with whatever is public information. So you'll see that when you type delta.io and you go into the GitHub Delta Lake page, there's amazing documentation that is written there. We want to provide you with like a first-class experience when you start using, Delta Lake in Synapse itself. And moving forward, we'll keep up with the community essentially. So, we want to collaborate with them. We want to make sure that we contribute whatever is possible to the open source Delta Lake so that you don't miss out on anything, and you will continue to see what is it that we are doing, in the Delta Lake realm. But at the same time, we want to be able to provide you with the best possible experience for Delta Lake inside Synapse itself.
Two things stood out about what you just said. I love that you said first class experience and the best experience, because isn't that what we want whenever we venture into a space that's somewhat unknown or we're not familiar with it? We want that experience to be first class. We want it to be good. Because that's going to encourage us to continue to move forward, to explore. So I love that Microsoft is taking the extra steps to present things that are usable and kind of almost ready to go. So I think it's great to hear that you're doing that and that you're going to continue to do that going forward. Digging a little bit deeper into support, how about multi-use Spark clusters? Is that something that you're supporting or plan to support later?
Saveen, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So multi-user clusters is we should break apart the concepts of what that means.
Sure.
Okay. So let's just start with a cluster. So cluster is, again, it really maps that classic dedicated model, right? And if you'll notice, when we talk about Spark and Synapse, if you read the docs, it actually says serverless Spark pools, right? Under the covers, if you were to dig deep into what's actually happening, is there a cluster? Yes, somewhere there is actually a Spark cluster. But we don't want people to think about that because it's not important to what they're trying to do. Just like in serverless SQL, something is being allocated. We don't want you to think that way. So in that vein of thinking, the cluster model, people sometimes think, oh, let me have a Spark cluster. And they imagine they're spending money. Remember, they're dedicating resources. Let's add more users to that, right? And they do that for maybe a couple of reasons. Number one is that cluster shares the same Spark metadata. So all those developers can party on the same Spark tables. That's a classic reason. Another thing they're trying to do is save money, because rather than have one Spark cluster for each developer, they stuff them all into the same thing and hope everyone's going to be play nice. Okay. Now let's talk about the first thing, which is sharing data. Now the good news about a Synapse workspace is all data in Spark tables in Synapse is shared to all the Spark developers in the workspace. So there's no need to create separate clusters if that's your goal, okay? Everything just works very well together. That's part of the great integration we offer. But the second reason about cost is this, right? The second reason is about security. When you have that cluster model and you have people doing things, sharing on the same nodes, you actually run into a risk that people processing data, even temporary data, other users can read it. And that is an extremely hard thing to tease apart and fix in a multi-user cluster model. So our approach is deliberately not to go down that route. We want everyone to simply use a different, just keep using Spark, and they're completely isolated from each other, right? And now let's deal with the third issue, which is really the cost issue, which is, people are trying to save money by stuffing all the users together. Our answer for that is simple. Go ahead and just have them use the workspace and start Spark jobs, and we'll scale up and down as they need, right? And they can actually control in their serverless Spark pools the maximum they're going to spend. So they're going to have good cost control as well. So those are the three reasons why we're not going to go down the multi-user cluster model. We're going to make it great for multiple users to use Spark in Synapse.
I appreciate that, and I know in hearing that response, one of the main features that people are most concerned with was security. So I'm so glad that you made mention of that as well. When we talk about Synapse and these type of technologies, I think one of the things that people are most curious about is the best way to get started. So I wanted to address that twofold. I wanted to address that technically, but I also wanted to address that professionally. As a professional, how would you get started if you don't have a background in this space? And technically, how would a company ready themselves to get into this space?
Okay, let's start with the second one first, a little bit easier. This is, I believe you're asking, if I'm someone who's a data engineer, but I don't really have a background in either technology or Synapse specifically, obviously, what do I do next?
Yes.
Right? And sort of the first starting point is there's no substitute for getting your hands dirty. Right? You've got to kick the tires of the product. The good news is, if you go to our documentation page for Synapse, you're going to see a link at the very toward the top for something called a Get Started article. It's actually 10 small documents. And just for reference, I wrote each one of the 10. Okay, so I know exactly what's in it. And it takes you on little small baby steps. Create a workspace, query with SQL, query with Spark, move data between. And by the time you've gone through those 10-something steps, you will have kicked all the basic tires of the product. And that'll get you up and ready to start really exploring and start doing things like using Delta Lake and doing machine learning with Spark. So that's the starting point, I would say. And leading off from that, we actually have, on Microsoft Learn, we have training, et cetera, right? And in the future, we're going to publish on our Azure page a full list of all the things a practitioner should do to get up and running and learn about Synapse, right? And now the first part of your question, could you repeat it again, please, Cheryl?
Technically, how do people get ready to start using Synapse? What do I need to do within my environment? Or is there anything I need to do with the data? Or can I just jump in?
You can just jump in.
Oh.
So you don't need to, you don't need to have any data ready. All you need to do is go to the Azure portal and you create a Synapse workspace. And the only information other than your subscription you need is the name of the workspace. Once you've got it, we have tons of sample data you can pull in and start playing, right? Now, if you're an organization, right, I'd recommend all your engineers go through that same process. Also, we have via Microsoft Learn a set of specific training and learning modules to help your data engineering staff understand what it is to be a data engineer in Azure, and a big component of that is Synapse. So that's our more formal way for an organization to get ready.
I think that is really what people want to hear. One of the things that I'm hearing and I'm gathering from this conversation is to leverage what's provided. So you provided two separate areas of resources. You provided the documentation that's available online, and then you also talked about MS Learn, which is a robust learning pathway for individuals to dig even deeper into these technologies, as well as learning about analytics, machine learning, all available there through Microsoft Learn. I love the fact that there's kind of how-to documentation, because I think when you pivot and when you change to a different technology or learning about something, sometimes that can be a bit overwhelming. So I like that Microsoft has basically left some breadcrumbs for us to capture bits and pieces of a technology and start to build our own experience, because that's really what it is. As you said, jump in, get your hands dirty. It's all about having the experience. We could read about it, but what's better is actually getting in, doing it. It's wonderful to be able to use your own data, because then it's not this generic data set. You're using your own, you know your data, you know what it's supposed to do. So I think those two avenues for learning, to me, kind of levels that playing field and says that everyone can have an opportunity, if this is their focus, to dig in deeper and learn about Synapse and learn about these technologies. So I think those are both wonderful resources to do that.
And Cheryl, coming to the breadcrumbs, it brings something very interesting to mind. So there's also certainly for the folks who feel very adventurous, there's also the fact that some of the core pieces inside Synapse are also open sourced. So if people want to dig in beyond the documentation, want to understand how Microsoft is actually implementing some of these things, like take let's say .NET for Spark, or similar to how they can peek into Delta Lake, because it's all open source. They can peek into .NET for Spark, they can peek into Hyperspace, they can talk to the team that's actually building all of this stuff. They can look through the code to understand, is this code even the right thing for their business logic, essentially. So I think from that aspect, there's also this other avenue for folks who feel like, hey, I want to understand really like what's really happening inside before I get in. There's also this other option that I felt was pretty interesting, in fact.
I love that. Breadcrumbs reminds me of my old PHP days, but I love the fact that we continue to talk about open source. You and I had a conversation, and I love that you continue to kind of weave in the community, because really this is about the community. When you talk about open source, it's not one person running the whole process. It's contributors that are sharing their experiences, kind of providing us kind of the what if scenarios that continue to build and help this product evolve. So we encourage individuals to make those suggestions, challenge us, ask us the questions, because as we join in that experience, or you join in the experience with us, it only helps to improve what we're already doing. I'm so excited about this, and I really want to thank both of you guys for taking the time to talk about these experiences, to talk about these questions, because I feel like we're at this stage that there's so much opportunity to learn, and the fact that you're both able to present these avenues, to me, is encouraging for anyone to take a step and to see what both of these products are about. So I thank you both for your time today in sharing about this topic.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. That was great. Lots of really great questions. So thank you all. As I mentioned at the beginning, we will be doing all 3 of these Azure Synapse sessions again this afternoon, starting at 4 p.m. Pacific time. We hope that you can join us. And then I've also shared a link to the Reactor YouTube page, where there will be recordings available if you cannot join us for the live sessions and weren't able to make the other 2 sessions this morning. Thank you all so much, and we hope you will join us again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.